Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about Falchions. Now what prompted this is nobody's been making any video requests. Remember, that's what the whole Genie thing is about. Make your requests, I'll see if I can do them. And I basically decided to go around on the internet and look at the Answers website. Used to love that back in the day, people with their essay-length answers and interesting debates going on about things. Quite fun, but it's collapsed since then. And while I was looking around for questions on swords, there was a genuine question that ought to have a decent answer to it, which was, what is a falchion? And someone answered that, and this was about a year ago that they'd done it. So what do you think is the great answer? So, when somebody asked, what is a falchion? Our intrepid answerer said, a sword. No shit! Of course it's a sword! We know that! Obviously, the absolute wanker was going to ignore the premise of the question of asking what specifically is a falchion and just give a dumb answer to show how stupid they are. So anyway, that rant aside, we're going to look at the specifics of what makes a falchion, and then have a look into the various details of what they are, why they exist, and things like that. We'll start with the comparison to arming swords. So, arming swords. The contrast item we're going to look at today is sort of like what I've got in my hands here. This is of course a blunt training version, so don't mind that, but it's a good simulator anyway. So, parts make up an arming sword. You've got the pommel, which is a useful functional item. It can act as a counterbalance as well as a striking surface and can also leverage against the hand. So the versions you tend to get purchased online don't represent it so much because you tend to have one-size-fits-all grips. So you tend, on anyone who's got smaller than massive gargantuan Goliath hands will find there's a gap between the cross and the pommel because people don't measure their hands. But a pommel can leverage, and it's a hard thing to describe, but it's the feeling where you're basically pushing as you leverage your hands. You're pushing against the pommel, and that can help leverage the sword. So you're not just holding it in the grip, you can actually push up and down against the pommel, and that leverages the sword into the target. And then the same thing can happen at the top in the cross guard. So again, you're leveraging at the target. These features exist on arming swords and also on falchions quite a bit. And apart from that, pommels can strike, so I could do something like a basic mortar, which is like a murder stroke, and just go bash! This is a genuine technique. I know it looks dumb, but not all techniques look beautiful. Sometimes they're just brutal. That's how life goes, because they are fighting techniques after all. They're not just there for theatrics. And then with regards to a crossguard, I mentioned about that striking purpose. Also, they're good for, people realise it's good for guarding, so I've got something physically to protect the hands, particularly leveraging cuts. Also, if let's say someone cut at my head, I parry, it might stick for a bit because edges tend to dig into each other a bit, but then they'd have the chance to come a bit free and then slide down. That obviously keeps my hands safe, but also it can be used for trapping. So let's say someone attempted a similar sort of cut to the neck. So I've gone and parried it a bit higher this time. I've then leveraged over the blade and I'm hooking still, keeping on top of it. So this is an important thing. If you're in sort of open, loose play, people can be doing basically whatever, and it's more like a mind games type of thing. And as someone who's not an advanced psychologist, I don't like this. So physically controlling the sword so you know where it is, you then, let's say, parry that blow, trapped and continue to hold over there, and then you have the opportunity to leverage a cut or some other action. People also use it to lead into half sword, which is where you grip the sword part way up and then manipulate it finally in tight spaces, and can manipulate that point into an exact spot like an eye socket in a helmet or something like that. Very useful technique. Works with arming swords and falchions. Now here we'll get on to the contrast where they're different. Double edge. Arming swords have double edges on them. Now this is a useful thing for cuts and also for thrusts to a slight extent, but what they do in cuts, if you are doing more of a Germanic grip, like a thumb grip, so that's where you have the thumb on the flat, like so. If, let's say, I cut at someone's head this time, so if I was parried and I wanted to go to the other side, it would go something like this. So I've gone 1, 2. So I've rotated with my hands and I've come to the other side to attempt to cut. It can be quite fast, sure, but there is a little bit of a gap. There's that little bit of a delay, a reaction time, which is good for the defender and not so good for the attacker. They can have a chance to react and parry. So it could be, I've come in 1, parry, come around, parry. They've still defended against me, which is not so good. Whereas, with a double edge, we can do some dirty tricks. Thumb on the flat. So I've gone for what looks like the same sort of thing again. 1, 2. Hang on, no, I need to use... Sorry, I don't do the thumb grip very often. I'm more Italian than Germanic. So, yes, go this way. So go 1, 2. That was hard for the camera to see. I'll do it again. So I'm going 1, 2. So I'm able to go from 1, the first action, immediately rotate it into the next action. You can also do this with a non-thumb grip. So this one that I like to do is a diagonal version. So it'd be something like, I'm coming from my non-dominant side, and instead of going 1, 2, or more cleverly, 1, rotate 2, so I'm using the true edge, the front edge, I can instead go, let's get the footwork right, 1, 2. If I want to catch an opponent quickly, and also it leads into a hanging guard, so let's say I'm doing that leveraging cut, I could then exit in a parry, bit easier. Obviously no technique is perfect, but that's the sort of thing you can do with a two-edged blade, whereas a falchion is a single-edged blade. Now, let's have a look around for an example of a single-edged blade around here. What is a bladesmith going to do? Guess I'll just have to do the TV thing. Hang on, I've wanted to do this for years. You ready? Here's what I made earlier! Yes, I get to say the phrase. Here's what I made earlier. So, anyway, back to the serious topic. Single-edged blade. And again, fine point, that's another thing that's a comparison of arming swords. With a single-edged blade, it's a useful thing for a few reasons. One, it's easier to make. Let me tell you as a bladesmith. Oh, we've got to do it again. A double-edged blade. Here's one I made earlier. Yes, here's one I made earlier. So, in terms of forging a double-edged blade, it seems like such a simple thing. Oh, well, I've got a flat bit of steel. I forge this side, and then I forge this side. But life tends to give you more problems than that. What will happen is, when you start with a flat piece of steel, if you then forge an edge out, the way that it works as the hammer, particularly a standard flat face, you're not using something like a fuller or something that is hard to explain, like a wedge that hammers and squishes the metal in one particular direction. So when it's sort of like this shape that I'm doing with my hand, it makes the metal spread in these directions, it's sort of two directions, this way and this way. So you're in front and behind the wedge, which is great if you're doing something like widening a blade. Very useful for doing things like forging meat cleavers, like what I'm working on now. But if you're using the normal hammer face, like you imagine of your classic hammers, it will spread the metal in all directions. Now the reason this is important is because when you're forging a double-edged sword, like an arming sword, you start with a flat piece of metal. Now because it's not just spreading widthways, it's also spreading lengthways. The thicker part isn't spreading, the part that you're not hammering, and the part that you are hammering is spreading. So what will happen is, you start off with a straight bar of metal, you start hammering out the edge, and what it'll do is, it will start curving. It'll do this. You have like a katana effect. You start with a straight bar, forge an edge, and it starts curving away from what side the edge is on. So I could start here, and if I forge this left edge, I'm going to see the blade start pushing away right in that curve. And then, yeah, sure, you might think, oh, just do the other side then. So you start hammering the other side, and then it curves. Except you'll then find that it doesn't have it. Even if you got the point straight, so the line between the point and the grip is straight, there's still a bit of snaking going on, because one bit's a bit more forward than the other, and oh, it's a nightmare, okay? It's a nightmare, I'll tell you that. This took a lot of effort. I know this is a pretty cheap example of a double-edged blade, but even this took a lot of hours. So making a single-edged blade is so much easier. Oh no, it started to curve a bit. Well, I just take it and put it on the anvil, slap, 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 and then just get it nice and straight. Or while I'm part way through forging, just like hammer it straight. Or you can go in advance, make it slightly curved in the opposite direction, and then as you forge it out, it starts to straighten back out, and then you can. It's easier. It's a lot easier. So it would be cheaper and quicker to make a single-edged blade if you need them en masse or you just need one cheaply. Great stuff. Another advantage is for cutting power. When I've made this double-edged blade, you'll notice there's that ridge in the centre. I need it to be, of course, an equal breadth for it to be fairly functional and well made and balanced. This is fine, except for the fact that that means, in terms of the edge geometry, I'm going from here, the broadest part of the edge, to here, the ridge. Which means I've only got about half the width in which to make the edge geometry. As this starts to get onto narrower blades, especially, you'll find that it's hard to get a particularly sharp edge. And indeed, the narrowest blades tend to be thrust-oriented and are bad cutters. Most extreme examples, you should look at things like court swords or small swords from much later time periods. But with something like a falchion, easy times, single-edged, I've got basically almost the entire length. I could, if I wanted to, have the edge geometry go entirely from the start of the edge right the way back to the spine in one grind. Nice easy slope, fine edge, nice slicing action against flesh. Perfect stuff. Now, another thing that differentiates the arming sword from the falchion is you'll often find, now this varies because when you've got things like the gross messer, it's like called a long knife, it's very similar to a falchion, and you've got to make an arming sword. Some falchions are full tang and some are a peened tang. It depends on the design. Now what do I mean by this? So here's an example I made with a peened tang. So what you have is you have a sort of rod of metal just going through the handle all the way and out the other side, and then to hold it all together I just basically start hammering it and it mushrooms and then squishes down and squeezes this handle together into a fully formed construction. And that's how this is solid. This is not glue, this is not some sort of epoxy or something like that. This is a mechanical hold. It's something that can work in historical time periods. You know it will work because unlike a dirty chemical hold, like if someone's glued a cheap kitchen knife together and just explodes apart, this will hold. And I know it has because I've chopped things of it and it's still in one piece. Now, by contrast, a lot of falchions and these sort of messers and other such blades can also frequently have a full tang, which is something more like this. So you'll notice these little pins here in the grip, they're holding it together, and look at that. It's like a sandwich. So you've got, on this side and this side, you've got, hang on, let's see if I can get it better in the light, you have the wood. This is, I think, pine wood. I made it from a bit of old furniture. And then in the centre of the sandwich, the filling, is the steel, and it's all one piece from the blade. Now, you might be wondering, can I see an example of that bare bones? I'll do it again. Yes, I'm going to do it again. Here's what I made earlier! So anyway, this is what you can see in a full tang design when it's exposed. So, and I'm taking a risk here because this is actually sharp, and if this slides, I'm going to get sliced right open. But this sort of Bowie knife type of design I'm working on, if you look, you've got these pinholes, and you've got the main metal, which goes all the way, this is one piece, from, is that a bit of, I don't know what that was, all the way from tip, right the way through to the base of the handle, or even to something like a pommel, all the way through in one piece. Very durable construction. This is why I swear by full tang blades. I've made so many of them. They will last, and they will last, and they will last. Get a blade like this. I always have concerns that when I say it's lasted, when I'm cutting something, there's always a chance that the handle could just split and break apart. It could start to come loose and rattle and get, it will be together, not, not destroyed, but still really horrible to use. And I've had people experience this with sharp blades and training blades where it starts rattling and it's no longer giving the force and the blows because it's coming loose. Full tang blades do not do that, and a lot of falchions are full tang blades like that. So, and this one is also a full tang blade, and basically, unless someone directly strikes the handle, in which case they're probably cutting through my hands first, this handle is going to last as long as the sword does. So on something like a falchion, you're not thinking, oh no, is it going to rattle, is it going to come free? Nope. Nope. This grip will last as long as you or the sword does. You're going to wait until that blade has snapped in half and you've got to desperately pick out your backup dagger or something before you worry about that grip coming free. Very useful thing. But also we should have a look at the dynamics on why falchions exist. So, falchions and arming swords were fairly contemporaneous to each other, meaning they would probably have been used on the very same battlefields, maybe directly opposing each other. I've mentioned about the tactical purposes you've got on things like arming swords. Falchions, it's just like arming swords, can be cut and thrust. Some of them are a bit more thrust oriented, some of them a bit more cut oriented, though I will say, when you're looking at the more thrust oriented blades, they are usually in the arming sword range, because those with their double edges can get narrower, especially towards the tip, and become much finer. With the double edges, those are something I forgot to mention, a double-edged blade is cutting. If you thrust into a target, it's cutting on its left edge, it's cutting on its right edge, front, back, whichever you want to call it, true edge and false edge, as you're opening up the wound by thrusting in through it, or opening up something like links in mail armour. Useful stuff. Now, with something like a single-edged blade, it's not doing that. You can have, so on something like this sax type of knife, you can have a single-edged blade, and it still has a fine point behind it. But overall, you're going to end up more along these sorts of lines. A single-edged blade lends itself to making a cutting, a sort of slicing and chopping type of blade, more than it lends to things like thrust. So again, it varies wildly between individual examples, but broadly speaking, falchions and messers tend to be more leaning towards cutting dynamics than thrusting dynamics. You'll find plenty of overlap in examples. We've got cut-oriented arming swords, thrust-oriented falchions, but broadly speaking, falchions are more cut-heavy. And with they tend to have broader blades, which are good for the dynamics. So the broader a blade, the more it gives you the aerodynamics. If you've got something that's just a very narrow blade, it feels a bit like a very long sort of like pen or something in terms of its aerodynamics. It's hard to gauge where your edge is aligned because there's so little air resistance going through. Whereas the broader your blade, the more it's sort of aerodynamically, think like a sail, it resists against the air. It's quite subtle, but you'll feel it in the cut. It sort of guides your blade into the optimum cut. So with a broader blade, like on a falchion, it's easier, especially if you're newer, to get a more decent cut. Because, listen, if I take... I don't have any examples of narrow blades with me, but listen to the difference. So here is a good quality cut. Might hear a slight bit of air resistance. Might not hear it on a camera, but there is a slight bit of air resistance. Only very slight, just because of the physical thickness of the sword itself. Now if I flat slap, you can hear it. That is the air resistance, and that is taking some effort from me. Those earlier cuts were much easier than that flat slap. And that is the natural inclination for that sword to want to guide itself into an aerodynamically efficient cutting action. Falchions are good for that. So I'd say they're good for beginners. But really, same with arming swords, if you've got a broad blade, it will guide the cut more. Whereas flat slap, you can hear it in the air, it's going to want to go towards the edge instead. Very useful stuff. And another thing to bear in mind with falchions and messers, again, there's a bit of crossover, and sometimes there's overlap. Where does one begin and the other end? A messer, by that I mean it's German for sort of knife, and a Großmesser or a Langmesser means like a big knife or a long knife, meaning basically something of that full tang sword design, single edge, full tang single edge knife design I should say, that's sized up enough that this is absolutely a sword now. And yeah, so there's a lot of crossover, because you could say that about a lot of falchions that can have practical purposes outside of combat, or you've got things like a Großmesser, which is definitely not for cutting brush or other such practical applications, cutting through wood and hedgerows. You're instead using it as a self-defense weapon. Yeah, there's a lot of, that's why I'm a bit vague on that, because there's enough overlap that you could have many examples of blades that you could call a falchion or a messer. They're the same in those instances. But something that would be more distinctly thinking more like a messer is something like a Großmesser, a big knife. It's more like something that's good for sort of practical purposes. Think like a European's idea of a machete. So again, we're looking at that type of cut and thrust blade. It is more of that sword-like design, because that's what people are thinking of and what bladesmiths are creating in their mind and then in physical objects. Versus something like a falchion, more heavily falchion and messer is more like a war sword, something that is not, you could use it for maybe cutting some brush, but this is clearly a weapon, something for fighting with. It's designed and optimised not for cutting down trees or for clearing through hedgerows, it is a fighting object. So that's where I'd put the distinction, but again there's so much overlap between the two that you can often see examples that are both. But that gives you an idea of what falchions and messers to some extent are like versus things like arming swords. Let me know what you think about that stuff in the comments, and I shall see you in the next video. Ta-ra for now.